Zanak shook his head, pushing his negative emotions aside. Renner looked back at him as if she was looking at a cryptid. Just ignore her, Zanak. Speaking of brain, the moment Zanak is crowned king, his first action would likely be to retrieve the 4 treasures of the kingdom from his father. Though he was uncertain if his father would hand them over so easily, it's imperative for him to entrust the treasures to Brain, otherwise it would be an insult to the sacrifices he's made. He wasn't the kingdom's warrior captain, he was just Renner's subordinate, a peasant with no fealty to speak of. If the kingdom's treasures were to be given to him, there would be no doubt the nobles would have dissenting opinions against it. Even so, how about we just declare that we intend to become a vassal state of the Sorcerer's Kingdom? Renner's goal was to live out her life in a small manner with Climb, which would still be achievable even if they became a vassal state. No, it's safe to say that if the value of royalty fell, it would have an inverse effect on their personal safety. Perhaps Renner's suggestion would create the best outcome for her. Zanak scoffed at Renner's proposal. The state of the internal affairs of our country and that of the empires is completely different. Civil disorder would occur the moment we suggest it. Under the leadership of the Bloody Emperor, the empire was as solid as a rock. Dissenting nobles had been purged long ago, which is why when they chose to become a vassal state, there was no opposition whatsoever. Never mind the fact that the empire hadn't had a taste of the Sorcerer's Kingdom's wrath. Even if they were disgusted by the agreement on the inside, it's not as though they had the desire to seek retribution. The empire had a clear-cut understanding of exactly how terrifying the Sorcerer's Kingdom could be. The kingdom, however, was in a different situation. As of now, the kingdom was split between the royal faction, the noble faction, independents, and a new faction which was formed shortly after that battle. The distribution of power between the 4 factions was roughly 3-3-2-2. The most troublesome of them all was the new faction. It was composed mostly of spare men from noble families that had lost both their head and successor, men who obtained power not meant for them. The other members lacked the common sensibilities that were expected of the aristocracy, and had no respect for the unspoken rules. As a result, many of them lacked integrity and manners. Spy reports showed that more than a few of them were drunk on power. They were the cancer of this nation. However, since they had autonomy in their own lands, nothing could be done about them unless they broke the law of the kingdom. Even if they did, there was no guarantee on how the other factions would react when the royal powers were exercised. This was no longer the pre-war era when the royal faction held the upper hand in political power. Still, Renner's suggestion of vassalization was not totally out of the question. It could be considered if the situation was to change drastically. No, that will not happen. There will not be any civil disorder, Onisama. Renner naturally followed with a counter. Don't lie to me, Zanak thought. Although he could tell that she wasn't being serious, it would not have been a problem even if Zanak was stupid enough to fall for it. Zanak had learned to see through her facades long ago. It was precisely because of this reason that women like her should not be trusted. If only Lys had returned. Zanak suddenly felt a sense of loneliness deep down in his heart. Though he couldn't call Marquis even a friend, he was still someone who shared Zanak's concerns for the kingdom. Zanak was concerned by the fact that it may no longer be possible for them to work side by side with each other, as the Marquis' replacements at hand were all terrifyingly talented but also uncontrollable wildcards. Zanak turned to face Renner in a pretentious manner, as if doing so would rid him of his sorrows. Still, I find it hard to believe that the Empire would actually import goods from the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Well, that was an awkward way to change the topic, not that I mind. Those things aren't that bad for a vassal state like the Empire, right? The most exported goods from the Sorcerer's Kingdom to the Empire in terms of the revenue they generated were undead creatures. Apparently they were distinguished by categories such as menial labor, military service, cargo transportation, and so on. Oi, we're talking about the undead, remember? The enemy of the living. But they don't require sustenance and don't get tired. Frankly speaking, they're the best kind of worker you could hope for. You're correct in thinking that importing the Sorcerer King's undead into our country would be risky, since it would essentially be us allowing another nation's soldiers onto our own soil. But on the other hand, it's also a gesture to the Sorcerer's Kingdom that its vassal does not have anything to hide from them. They're basically handing the other end of the leash they placed on themselves over to the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Renner raised her head towards the ceiling. In some ways, this is an admirable attitude that we could learn from. It is a good way to show that they can easily threaten us. That's true, if a superior cannot trust their inferior, it's definitely more reassuring to have a firm grasp on their weaknesses. I can somewhat understand the Empire's actions if I look at it from that perspective. It looks as though Irantal and the Dwarven nation in the Vassalization Mountains have initiated trade relations. They're exchanging undead miners and fresh ingredients for ores and high-quality Dwarven-made farming equipment. This was according to the intel they had received from their spy in Irantal, who had met with some dwarves. Cargo hauling within the Vassalization mountain range can simply be handled by the undead. Apparently the shipping and labor costs are basically negligible, so much so that it's cheaper for them to buy from the dwarves than from us. That's right. Are we abandoning the plans to form an alliance with the council state? Ah yes, that's currently in progress, but the situation isn't great. Though a dragon lord has agreed to it, we still need more time to convince the representatives of the other races. Though even if this falls through, the prospect of an alliance would not be completely ruled out, that much was said. That was only partly true. The Anti-Sorcerer's Kingdom alliance was forming at a snail's pace, but progress was smooth nonetheless. They were at the stage of relying on the generosity and solidarity of other countries to hopefully get them to sign the Mutual Reinforcement Pact at all costs. In other words, it was an unreliable relationship without written agreements. Something like that could not be publicly announced as an alliance. There were simply too many things to do to form a tight alliance. They would need at least a few months to sort it out. Is that so? It would be great if we could form a military alliance as soon as possible. Now then, Oni-sama, when do you plan to take the throne? I feel like it's about time for you to fulfill your promise. The promise in question was that Renner would work alongside Zanak in exchange for a manor to live in secret with Klein, as well as the permission to do so. About that, just wait for a while. Surely you already knew of how the unofficial proposals are being dealt with soon. I've spoken to our father, and we've decided to wait for him to put forward his last major policy before making any moves. If the king commits a fatal mistake in managing the state, he will bear the responsibility and abdicate. If he made no mistakes, he would just propose more and more policies that are designed to upset the nobility, to allow the prince the opportunity to propose alleviating measures, in order to reduce their dissatisfaction. The king would then be abdicating in a fashion that would gain him favor with the nobles. Although a stigma could be left on the elderly king's reign, the benefits to the royal family far outweighed the detriments. Speaking of which, how's the orphanage going? Are you planning to cook something for them again? Do you need any financial support? That's not necessary, my allowance is enough for its operations. There should be somewhere around 50 of them by now. This was a significant figure, perhaps the greatest among all the orphanages in the kingdom. Despite that, Renner had not sought external support in running the orphanage's operations, which were funded entirely through her privy purse. Although as the third princess her allowance did not amount to much, it did substantially increase once her two older sisters were married off. It's certainly not impossible for her to fund the orphanage on her own, but big cuts in the number of maids tending to her must have been made to allow for that. Now that he thought about it, his sister seemed to only wear one set of clothes. The royalty should never do something that'll make the nobility look down on them. Zanak felt somewhat irritated but also proud that Renner knew how to spend her funds wisely. Do you want me to split some of my allowances with you? After all, the orphanage is an impressive feat in the eyes of the citizens. I cannot allow that. Her rejection was uncharacteristically staunch. If there are outstanding children in the orphanage, I intend to take them with me to the manor. I will not allow you to take any of my prospective labor force. Ah, so that's your plan. Exactly, I've requested Brain-san to help train them in swordsmanship. They should also start schooling soon. My efforts to nurture them have just begun. Then what about the children who are not so exceptional? Even if they could only do simple calculations aright, there will be a job waiting for them somewhere. Everything will work out just fine. So you would be fine with it if I take the rest of them? If you would do that, it would make me very happy. I would have to worry that some of the children will be left behind. Renner's voice was interrupted by the sound of someone violently knocking on the door. What's going on? What's with the commotion? Just as Zanak raised his voice, the door was suddenly opened. Your Highness. Emergency. A noble dressed in familiar court attire ran into the room. He was one of the officials in charge of internal affairs. Tightly gripped in his hand was a piece of parchment. What happened? Zanak took one look at the parchment presented to him, and a surprised expression could be seen on his face. It was as though he could not comprehend its contents. No, it was more like he was in disbelief. What's wrong? Zanak did not have the strength to reply. Instead, he just passed the parchment paper to Renner in silence. And then... Ha! The sound that she made was uncharacteristic for her. It sounded like she was absolutely dumbfounded. Oh look, she's exposing her human side again. Zanak grinned in a way as if he had just given in to his despair.